This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast. Okay, this is episode 1 of Cosmographia with Randall Carlson. We also have Mr. Brad. What's up, buddy?
I'm here, ready to do show 1.
Show 1. We also have Mike joining us.
I'm here too.
From Parts Unknown. Randall.
Sir.
Yes. So tell us about these two guys. Why are they here?
Yes, sir.
What's going on?
For duty. Oh. Good question. Well, Bradley's been my cohort for over 20 years. 22 years, 23 years. I'm losing track. I've covered more miles around this planet with this guy than any other living human being. So there's that. And then there's Mike. Now, Mike was originally a client of my building company. That's how we know him. And a lot of the conferences we did from this Mike studio was what we built for him. What year was that, Mike? How many years ago?
Oh,
15 years ago we built that studio?
7 or 8 years ago? It's not been 15.
Yeah, it was like 2011. That was
Oh, that's when we built
10
that studio?
and 11.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's how we know Mike. And Mike, when I met Mike, he was working for CNN. What was your official title?
I was a video editor and producer.
Video editor and producer. Yeah, so it seemed natural that Mike would sort of get involved in helping move this kind of thing forward with his background. And we have recorded a number of things. There's some of the YouTube videos that are up online, and we recorded over at that studio. So Brad, we met actually at a, I think it was a UFO conference, right?
That was probably the first time, yeah.
Somewhere, it was some weird thing. A lot of very strange people, I remember. And you sort of stood out because you were not quite as strange as the majority of the people there.
Yeah, so, early 90s in Atlanta.
What year would that have been?
That was probably 94, 95.
Early 90s, okay. Yep.
Yeah, I was doing the geometry with Fred Mills back then, and Monuments on Mars was his big fascination. So yeah, I was out helping him at a I think it was 32nd annual UFO Congress convention, something I could pull out of the old flyers from it. But yeah, that was probably the first time.
That would be the late Fred Mills,
correct,
who did some really interesting work, by the way, which we could possibly look at sometime.
Yeah,
it'd be good to preserve some of that stuff that he did. And Brad is sort of now is caretaking that legacy of research that he did, but
it's true.
We have not done anything with it.
Oh man, that's
so yeah, we've done a lot of traveling together and gotten in a few scrapes and gotten out of some scrapes and discovered some new things and met some great people on the way. And yeah, one thing has led to another. That's how we're here with you guys.
That's right.
Because we hooked up with Darren Grimes up in Calgary, and I don't remember how I first connected with the Grimerica boys, but we did a trip up there 4 or 5 years ago and did some
15.
exploring up in the Canadian Rockies. We were looking, what year? 2013?
2015.
2015. Yeah, it sounds more like it. So 4 years ago, we were, looking for evidence in the Canadian Rockies for catastrophic glacial melting in order to see if there was a connection between glacial melting over the southern Canadian Rockies and the Scabland erosion in eastern Washington. And I think we came away not disappointed that the evidence is abundant that what we're looking at is a very rapid melting of the ice complex, the Cordilleran ice complex over Canada, over over the Canadian Rockies. Let me say that. And there would have been the only place that could have gone, at least in certain of the river valleys, the Rocky Mountain Trench, the Upper Columbia, the Thompson River, the Okanagan River. The only place that meltwater could have gone was south, which would have discharged it right onto the northern rim of the Channel Scablands. So we were up there exploring that. And Graham, that particular group, I guess that was when there were 8 of us. And Graham put us up. Darren put us up and then acted as a guide for a couple of days. Yeah. We went out and did some exploring, had a lot of fun, came up with some new terminology in the process for geological features.
Yeah, we did.
Which at some point we can share with people. So we can add it into the dictionary of geological terms.
Yes.
Squigliosity, for example.
Gotta have a glossary.
Sure. Important.
Yeah. That's an important new term now. We can add to the geological lexicon. Squigliosity, and we can show some really nice examples of that. There's actually a lot of it throughout the Canadian Rockies.
All right.
So now how we got hooked up. Was that? Pardon me.
Squigliolithic. Can we apply that geological term across the board there?
Squigliolithic, yes, I think we could. I imagine there's going to be a number of bifurcations of the definition of the term that we can apply to different subtexts and so on.
Great.
Yeah. And we've got some others too. We've got a number of others. But I'll save those for future podcasts we can talk about. So we know each other just because we hung out in Colorado we met in effect over these the Zoom conferences, and so I kind of was prepared. I kind of knew what to expect. So some of the initial trauma was mollified because we'd had those 10 Zoom conferences beforehand. So then when I actually met you guys, I was psychologically prepared, and so we then hung out for 10 days. In Colorado, had a great time. We shared some adventures. We did some climbing. We did Chimney Rock 3 times. Yep. So 3 times. We did Mesa Verde 3 times, and that was my first trip to Mesa Verde, and that was one of the reasons I've been wanting to explore Mesa Verde for a long time. Yeah. And so when Darren first asked for suggestions where we could hold this contact at the cabin, I suggested Southern Colorado because I had an ulterior motive, and that was I get a chance to explore Mesa Verde, and I was not disappointed.
No, yeah, that was a fantastic.
Not at all. It was everything that I expected it was going to be. But what is still puzzling me is the thing we talked about as we, were cruising up and down up onto the plateau was the nature of these canyons and the erosional complex through this plateau region and the whole genesis of that landscape, which has still completely got me baffled. Yeah. Because the scale of the thing that's implied by what we were looking at is almost too much for me to even wrap my head around. So I'm searching for more mundane explanations to explain the existence of that table with these huge incisions cut into its surface. And so far, I'm not having very much luck doing that.
Yeah.
See, the problem. This is the problem Randall has. He doesn't think big enough.
Mike has been chastising me for years now that I'm not thinking big enough. I'm trying, Mike. Come on, give me a break, man. I'm trying. There's only so much that a guy can wrap his head around at once. You see, I have to integrate single pieces at a time. Yeah. What were you about to say, Russ?
Well, I was just going to say
about your impression of Mesa Verde.
Yeah, Kyle and I have
discussed, and what we saw out there.
We've discussed it multiple times, obviously, since we've been there and come back, and we've done our own shows on it. And I don't understand the timeline like the features are so enormous, and then you're like, well, how are they up there? How did they get up there? And did the erosion happen before or after? And it's just, and the landscape itself is just, it's gigantic, and then the whole thing's sort of tilted, and then when you get that overhead view, you see that it's sort of it's almost very regular. There's kind of the lines are all parallel. It's very strange.
Mm-hmm.
So. Mm-hmm. And Brad and I discovered.
There's actually. Go ahead.
Brad and I discovered that we have a mutual passion for standing on the very edges of things, up places. We both love to do this.
Okay.
Like Brad and I bonded over that, standing on the very edges of stuff, looking down over things. He was
he's a little more aggressive about it. He went to run right up to it. I was not quite in that mode.
Well, I'm glad that I wasn't there to see that. That's all I can say. Because I've had a number of episodes there where my heart is up in my throat.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing Brad poised on the edge of the precipice with his video camera leaning out, like, Brad, you're within about a quarter inch of your center of gravity being on the wrong side of that precipice. So be careful. Because, the thing is, it would really suck if I'm out with somebody like Brad and he falls off a precipice into 1,000-foot deep canyon.
Yeah.
That would basically suck.
Yeah.
But it might be newsworthy.
Well, that's true. Well, yeah, one of our primary objectives, and especially if we're taking new people out, like for the first time on a trip, generally as we're kind of coaching them, getting them prepared, we say we have a number of priorities, right? And we could go down that list. But the first priority, the number one priority when we're out on these trips is don't get killed.
Yeah.
Number one.
Yeah. That's it. Don't get killed.
Right. All right. So let's talk about what our goal here is with this podcast. So we've got the podcast. This is episode 1. It's going to progress. We're going to discover new things and new ways to do it. But we're just banging out the first episode. So one of the things we talked about is you have all this material. You have 10,000 slides or something. And one thing that this podcast will allow us to do is to give you and us time to just go through that material detail by detail in some kind of order. And also we can talk about, what's going on elsewhere in the news. We could talk about earthquakes and, space, but mainly you have all this material, and this will give us a way to get it out there and archive it in a coherent fashion, right? That's what I see as a goal. What do you guys see?
Semi-coherent.
Semi-coherent. Yeah. Well, it is Randall, so it'll be semi-coherent.
That's exactly what I'm envisioning. And I think what we'd try to focus on if we're going to, the title here is Kosmographia. So we're going to focus on cosmographic and what that definition is.
Yeah.
And at this point, maybe it would be apropos to share the screen.
Yes.
Screen of the old original website that we did 20 years ago.
Let's see it.
Okay, let's do that. Let's see over here.
And while you're doing that, I just would like to say to the audience that we've been trying to work out the inside baseball of how we're going to put this whole thing together with the video so Randall can show his slides.
Yep.
And everybody's in different places. And so we've got this format. We're going with it. It's a little glitchy at the moment, but we're going to keep getting better. So stick with us through all that.
That's right. All right. Screen's up.
Good deal. All right. So this was sort of the original idea, catastrophism in ancient cultures, and cosmographic in the old definition, which I find in older dictionaries from about the earlier 20th century up to about the 60s and 70s, is the definition that I like. And that's the definition that we've chosen here. And I'll read it. Cosmography is the science which describes and maps the main features of the heavens and the earth, embracing astronomy, geography, and geology. A description or representation of the universe or world in its main features. And it comes from the Greek Kosmographia, which just simply means a description of the world. So the things we would mostly be looking at would be those topics that were listed there: astronomy, geology, geography, which would encompass a lot of looking at maps, integrating those maps with studies of landscapes and landscape evolution. I think one of the things we would be looking at a lot would be geomorphology, which is the study of the form of the Earth, because the form of the Earth is the end product of a whole series of processes. And I think at this point we're sort of standing on the precipice of a new model of understanding Earth history, in that the old models that dominated science were the strictly gradualistic models, the uniformitarian models, whereas now the model is one of punctuated, to borrow the famous term, punctuated equilibrium, to borrow Stephen Jay Gould's term, which I think is very appropriate for what we're talking about here. The process is that there's two modes of global change. There's the mode that we've experienced within modern history, and then there's the mode, the punctuations within the continuum, where you have change accelerated by orders of magnitude. And so the contention here is that, or the working hypothesis, if you want to put it that way, is that it is these short-lived episodes that really are doing most of the work, whose end result is the landscape we've inherited, the landscape upon which and out of which we have built modern civilization, right? And so one of the other ideas of this is that the entire planet bears the imprint of these great transitional events. And we're only now at the very infancy of beginning to recognize the scale of and frequency of these events. Not only how they would have affected life, the evolution of life, and the biological domain on this planet, but now we're getting into understanding how these nonlinear of events have influenced or affected actually human history. And this is where it comes from being an abstract discussion about the history of the world to a much relevant discussion about how these forces, how these transitional phases may affect how they have affected culture, civilization in the past, and how they could do so in the future. So catastrophism, the other thing that I think that we would be addressing quite a bit in here, in these series of podcasts, we will define as the doctrine that certain vast geological changes in the Earth's history were caused by catastrophes rather than gradual evolutionary processes. So these are, I think, some of the key ideas, but around those we may be discussing a lot of different things. For example, so much of this kind of the insight that is now being provided to us by science through the investigation and the study of the Earth below our feet and the heavens above our head, is that we have inherited a legacy of ancient knowledge that also pertains directly to this, to the understanding of these changes that have occurred in the history of this planet. So when we begin to look at religious doctrines and mythological tales and folklore, things like that, we begin to find that, there's common threads throughout all of this, recognized, many decades ago by people like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and Mircea Eliade, that there are these sort of archetypal forms. Behind these forms, there might be residing actual events. But now these events were of such a scale and power and potency that they left an imprint upon the collective human psychology, and we've carried this stuff down with us, and we've preserved in the form of myths and legends and tales, various article stories, et cetera, knowledge and information about real events that we are now investigating scientifically. So the idea is here that we will be looking not only at the very scientific, the cutting edge science that's going on relative to these realms of inquiry, but also this incredible corpus of ancient knowledge that has come down to us in these various forms. So at many points throughout this, it will be very helpful and interesting to segue off of what we would think of as the hard science into some of these more traditional venues of information and knowledge. Yeah. So the forum for discussion is pretty wide-reaching under the terms of cosmography and catastrophism. And I think this, but we have to kind of narrow it down. I don't think at this point we're going to be talking about psychic phenomena too much. We won't be talking about UFOs too much. Maybe at some point we'll address that. There will be some subject matter that's being covered in a lot of other places that I don't think it's necessary for us to really get into.
Like we're not going to dive into
cryptids. But there may be times for, where, pardon me?
I said we're not going to dive into cryptids. We're not going to look at Bigfoot, stuff like that. But, but we will be looking at these.
No, probably not. We probably won't get into cryptozoology, although it's fascinating. Yeah. We will probably... Well, let's put it this way. We will be talking about Earth change, no question. We'll be talking about volcanoes. We'll be talking about, the sun. We'll be talking about asteroids and comets and impacts. We'll be talking about mass extinctions. We'll be talking about ice ages. We'll be talking about mega floods. Just in that list that I've given you there's almost a lifetime of fascinating and powerful information around those things. And every week, new things are being discovered. So, of course, we cannot avoid talking about the human past and the idea of ancient civilizations. So we're not going to stray or shy away from talking about the effects or consequences of these kinds of events for previous cultures, and even be open to the idea that there have been civilizations that existed in prehistory whose memory has been lost to us because of the nature of these global changes that have up until now been underappreciated by the scientific community, particularly those who are trying to reconstruct or to create models of our past.
Yeah.
So, there's plenty of fertile field there of things that we're going to get into in these talks.
Yeah. That's good. Okay, so let's...
Excellent.
That's awesome. So let's try. This is one thing I thought we could try. Can you give an outline of what you think has happened? Just real brief outline, basically, of what you think the most important catastrophic events, say, in the past 30,000 years, like a brief. Leading up.
Sure.
To
well, in the last 30,000 years, the critically important, I think, and the most powerful event would have been the Younger Dryas, the events around the Younger Dryas, both the inception and the ending of the Younger Dryas. Yeah. Between 11,600, say in broad numbers, 13,000 years ago. But clearly, when we look at the history of the last 30,000 years, what we see is that even going back to, like, say, 26 or 27,000 years ago, we see major changes. For example, if we start looking at the nomenclature of ice ages in North America, the last late glacial phase was called the Wisconsin Ice Age, and the Wisconsin Ice Age refers to a period of time during which this episode of large-scale glaciation took place over North America. Right now, in the older models of this, the Wisconsin Ice Age pretty much was unbroken for at least 100,000 years, maybe much longer than that. However, it became apparent that it was too oversimplified to talk about just the Wisconsin Ice Age. So you had to have, like, the early Wisconsin, the middle Wisconsin, the late Wisconsin, or the final phase of the Wisconsin Ice Age, which is now usually dated to around 26,000 years. And essentially, what that means is that the old model was you had this huge ice mass reaching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the northern United States up to the Arctic Circle. And for 100,000, 120,000 years, maybe longer, that ice mass may have fluctuated a little bit, but more or less remained intact. Whereas now there's enough evidence to suggest that the ice cap fluctuated much more dramatically than anyone had previously assumed, and that say if you go back 30,000 years ago to 35,000 years ago, the ice mass was considerably reduced in scale. It's not likely that it was completely gone like it is now, with the exception of Greenland. Greenland's ice is inherited from the late Wisconsin. Okay, but the assumption was that you had this mass, that it was there, it was pretty much intact, it maybe fluctuated around the edges, but now evidence suggests that it was way more dynamic than that. And so it appears that around 26,000 years ago, that was the onset of the final phase of this last great Wisconsin ice age, right? And prior to that, glacier masses were drastically reduced, and then around 26,000 years ago, they began to enlarge quite rapidly, and over the next 4,000 to 5,000 years grew to their maximum extent, 6 million cubic miles of ice, swallowing up more than half of North America, right? So then we get now to the late glacial maximum, which is usually considered to have occurred somewhere between 17 or 18,000 years ago up in about 20 to 22,000. The dates that define the LGM, or late glacial maximum, are pretty vague, actually. But if you can think in that period of time, let's say 18 to 21,000 years, late glacial maximum, and then things begin to warm up a bit, and this is due to changing geometric relations between the Earth and the Sun, right? We won't get into that without backup graphics and diagrams, but at some point in a future podcast, we can get into explaining the Milankovitch processes. Anyways, climate starts warming up, glaciers start shrinking, and while the Wisconsin Ice Age refers to a period of time, then the actual ice masses themselves have a name. Because in North America, there were two distinct ice masses, a larger one, a smaller one. The larger one was called the Laurentide ice sheet, and it was basically centered over Hudson Bay and covered all of eastern Canada and northeastern United States and the Midwest. When you get out to the western side of North America, you get into the Cordilleran region, reaching from northern Montana, Washington, over the Rocky Mountains, north up into Alaska. There was a separate secondary ice sheet. It's called the Cordilleran ice sheet. So those two great ice masses begin to grow rapidly between 22 and 26,000 years ago. And at the late glacial maximum, apparently they coalesced. They grew together on the plains of Alberta. Basically, right now in the area where you would go from Edmonton down to Calgary, Alberta, where the Grimerica boys live, would have been right in that corridor that opened up right during the warming and then closed up again, perhaps even during the Younger Dryas cold period. So the Younger Dryas comes along, and what happened was it reversed 3,000 years of gradualistic warming that had been causing the ice sheets to shrink and open up that corridor east of the Rocky Mountain front. So here comes the Younger Dryas episode, and suddenly all of that's reversed. All of that 3,000 years of gradual, more normal warming is just suddenly undone in a matter of a year maybe, right? So now the planet plunges back into full glacial cold. And this event, which is now dated at around the middle of 840 years ago, saw the final extinction of the great megafauna, sudden melting of large portions of the ice sheet, major climatic fluctuations, and the sudden disappearance of the Clovis culture that was quite prolific in North America. So you have 4 of these things correlated in time. And then, of course, we now come to the ever-growing mass of evidence for some kind of a cosmic impact event having occurred right at that boundary. The what is called the Balling Alarod. The Balling Alarod was this period of warming, and then it was separated by this boundary from the Younger Dryas. It's at this boundary that we find this black mat layer, which we can talk about in another podcast, and we'll pull up images of it, and we'll go into detail what the meaning of that black mat layer is that separates these two worlds, the world of the Pleistocene below it and the world of the Holocene above it. What differentiates the world of the Pleistocene from the world of the Holocene is the presence of these gigantic glacier masses over North America and Northwestern Europe, and the concomitant climate that was associated with that. Because you have to bear in mind that the climate of the Earth had to have been dramatically different if half of North America had a climate whose only modern analog is the South Pole.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. That's something people should think about. Not, when you want to talk about climate change, if we were going to try to do something equivalent today, we would have to basically, think of this. Here's a scenario, right? You have a mass of ice that's at least as big, maybe bigger. Probably some evidence suggests bigger than the mass of ice that now covers the South Pole. Well, let's suppose that about the time of the building of the pyramids, that ice mass over the South Pole began to melt. And by now, it was gone completely. So the whole continent of South America, not South America, but Antarctica, is now free of ice. Maybe some residual mountain glaciers remain in place, but basically it's free of ice, and now people could go in and begin to colonize. They could begin to farm and grow crops. How would you do that? How would you accomplish that? Well, it's pretty bizarre when you think about it, because we have, we go back 15,000 to 18,000 years ago, late glacial maximum. Imagine that you take that gigantic ice cap off the South Pole of planet Earth, you lift it up and you take it and you lay it down right over North America. And now you're covering over half of North America with it. So you got the problem of getting from a climate similar today into a full-blown ice age. Then you got the even more intractable problem, which is getting out of the ice age. And believe me, we have not got that figured out yet. I mean, maybe there's somebody that claims that, but I don't think there's certainly no consensus about what forces pushed this planet into an ice age and what fully brought us out. Clearly, if there was an impact-related event at the Younger Dryas, that would have had some role to play. But exactly what, I don't know. And I don't know, having perused the literature and listened to a lot of the scientists, talked to the scientists that are working on this, I don't think anybody really would claim, I've got it all figured out.
Right. So
but I think we can say this with certainty. Without encompassing the cosmic realm, we aren't going to figure it out.
Right.
Did it involve the sun? I'm thinking that it likely did involve the sun. Did it involve impacts of things from space? Yes, I think it probably did involve impacts of things from space. But the model we have to begin to look at now is to begin to understand that our whole solar system is like a machine. It all works together. See, and it's not like what happens to Jupiter has no consequences for what happens to Earth or what happens on the sun. Or what happens to the sun doesn't have consequences for what happens on Earth. And I think now this is some of the most interesting and cutting edge and important work I think that's going on now, which is suggesting activity, tectonic activity, which can include both seismic activity and volcanic activity in the Earth itself, may somehow be tied in to activity within the sun. You see, so these are some of the kinds of ideas I think that we would be exploring in upcoming podcasts, looking at some of these. And then going back into the archaic or traditional realm for additional insight, because that's another part of this. That's the corollary, I think, of all of this, is that we have inherited this amazing legacy of information. And this information is of direct relevance to us understanding some of these forces, because ancestors of ours, people that have walked on this planet before modern people, have experienced these events, have witnessed these things, and have gone to great lengths to preserve knowledge and information and insight about these events. And the sad thing is that the legacy of what we have inherited is such a small part of what once existed when you start thinking about the deliberate and the accidental destruction of various traditions, the destruction of great libraries and so forth. But what we do have is amazingly rich. And it boggles the mind to think about what would occasions be if the great library at Alexandria or at Carthage still existed.
Yeah.
When you're talking about destroying 800,000 or 1 million volumes of ancient knowledge, who knows what could have been in there and what kind of information there may have been about earlier civilizations that are now long forgotten. So anybody who comes along and pedantically says, oh, we've got it all figured out, and we know that there was only Stone Age people back then. No, we cannot say that. We cannot say that now anymore. 50 years ago, we could say that. But now, understanding the dynamic nature of this planet that we inhabit, no, we can't say that anymore. We can't say that there was nothing that we could have called civilization that existed 20,000 years ago.
Right. So part of the thing we'll be doing with this podcast in the future is we will be exploring your research into all these topics and subjects, right?
Sure.
And you're continuing research here, including you've delved into the myths, you've delved into the legends, and then you've delved into modern scholarly works onto this, and then you've gone into the field, and all of this will be incorporated, including whatever future field events that we all go on.
Absolutely. And because that's another thing, every week brings new discoveries. I mean, this is an amazing time we're living in terms of the new information that's coming to light. As has been said by those wiser than myself, new information has come to light.
Who are these fabled people who are wiser than you?
Well, you never heard of Jeff Lebowski?
Oh, yeah. New information has come to light, man.
Yeah, man. Hey, man, there's a beverage here, so.
Yeah.
Well, man, that sounds really exciting.
Yep.
Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, it ought to be fun.
Yeah. I think it should be fun. Brad?
And then we can piece by piece, we can slowly lay out our plan for global domination.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Slowly.
That was the last part I was going to ask you about. How are we going to rule the world? First, we have to take over the world, and then we
coming up in episode 2.
I think what we do is we just carve out a little piece of it, a little piece of the world, and then we rule that.
Okay, with an iron fist. It has to be with an iron fist.
Look, give me 20, 30,000 acres, I'll be happy.
Okay, we can rule that piece of the world with an iron fist. Well, I think.
I think.
Go ahead.
Brings us to one more thing, which is just that I think there are practical responses to this kind of information that are implicit within it, and exploring those would be, I think, very important and valuable to do. In other words, okay, so here's all this information about your situation, your human situation on planet Earth. Okay, given that information, what do we do with it? What is the appropriate response? What is the optimum response to this knowledge, to this information? Is it purely of academic interest, or is there practical and pragmatic plans of action that need to follow from this kind of information? And that, to me, is a big part of what this is. The purpose of this is to explore. Not only, here's the problem. Okay, the problem is we live on a planet that's far more dynamic than anybody had realized until just within the last decade or 2 or 3, right? So given that, we now know that, okay, and we're open to the idea that every so often these world-changing events happen. Up until this point, they're out of our control. Knowing this, is there a rational response to this information? Do we apply this information to our own civilization, so that what we do is we enhance the probabilities of our own civilization becoming successful in the long term. And I think that would have to be a major part of what we're talking about here. Yes, because this information exists. But I think the point is, it's not just of academic interest. Of course, it is of academic interest, but I think it has practical ramifications, far-reaching practical ramifications. And part of that would be, I think what we would be doing here is exploring what those ramifications would be. And are there courses of action that would enhance the probabilities of us being successful over the long term, living on planet Earth? And I think, because I'm generally an optimist, I don't go along with all of those who are basically thinking it's futile. We're destroying the planet. Because listen, let me say this: the planet has endured far, far worse than anything we have yet imposed upon it. That's not to say that we shouldn't, keep our house in order. Absolutely, we should. It's not to say that we shouldn't try to live in balance and harmony with the natural order as we understand it, because we absolutely should. But the point is once we begin to look into the dynamic history of planet Earth, we begin to see that, this planet has endured over and over and over again things, phenomena, forces far beyond anything we have yet imposed on it.
Right.
And in the political discussions today, it's just that insight into the nature of planetary history and our relationship to it tends to be downplayed, if not ignored altogether, because the scenario that's now being manufactured for public consumption is essentially our activity is destroying the planet. We're causing a 6th grade mass extinction, and if we don't make drastic changes to every aspect of our life, we're going to destroy the planet.
Yeah.
But we have to be really careful, because if it turns out that there are things, we're so focused on our own consequences that we're ignoring the bigger picture, we could get caught with our trousers down.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just,
we could.
While you were talking about that, I was just thinking of the, how people will say like, oh, the people will say like, what, so you think we shouldn't, we should just like do whatever we want? And it's like, no, just like, I can say that my house, can survive hurricanes and thunderstorms and everything like that, but that doesn't mean I won't vacuum the floor, right? Like you keep your space clean, even though it can handle far worse than you've ever thrown at it, right? Is basically what you're saying. I don't know if that's a good analogy or not. It just popped in my head. I'm like, yeah, you still vacuum the rug even though your house can handle a freaking thunderstorm, right?
Well, make sure you have a good roof on it.
That's right. Yeah, you gotta have a good roof.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to live where you're susceptible to forest, if you're going to live in the woods and you're susceptible to forest fires, put a standing seam metal roof on your house. Okay, that's just common sense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the analogy I use is no matter where you live, there's going to be some kind of natural disaster that it's only prudent that you are prepared to deal with. If you're living in the coast of South Carolina, it's good that you have some kind of plan in place for hurricanes. If you're living in Kansas or Nebraska, it's probably a good idea to have a plan in place, for tornadoes. You've got natural disasters, you got tsunamis, you got volcanic eruptions, you've got things that if people adapt to them and know how to respond, they will survive. Otherwise they don't. And here we'll talk about examples from recent history. Like a really powerful example would be the eruption of Tambora back in 1815, and what that did to the island and the culture. There was a whole culture that was essentially erased from existence within 1 hour. With a language that was lost, a whole heritage of mythology. There was a whole culture that existed on that island when Tambora erupted, and within 1 hour it was gone, completely erased, right? So there are these analogs that have happened in recent history that we need to look at, and we will look at those. Modern disasters, because, see, there's a scale of disasters, and each of these scales is separated by a threshold. So you might have a disaster that could be really devastating locally. Think of Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, and what it did to New Orleans. New Orleans is still not fully recovered from Katrina yet, right? And there are reasons for that. But the point is that what happened at Katrina didn't really affect, it had economic ripples, of course, but it didn't really directly affect somebody living up in Chicago or somebody living in New York. It didn't really affect us here in Atlanta. So a lot of the people actually in the aftermath of Katrina emigrated up here to Atlanta. I met quite a few people that, yeah, we were living in New Orleans and then we suddenly found ourselves without a home. Now we're living here in Atlanta. So Atlanta became kind of a place of refuge for people who were displaced during the Katrina disaster, right? So, but let's look at that and think about what would have happened. Now, see, the recovery was able to happen, and still the ongoing recovery is because the majority of the infrastructure surrounding it still is intact. It's still functioning, right? But what if you had an event that was, let's say, 1 order of magnitude greater than Katrina? Let's say an event whose environmental effects and so on were so extreme that you had the equivalent of 10 New Orleans wiped out like that, right? We could recover from that, but it would be a really big challenge, and it would require diverting lots of resources from all over to rebuild it. Now think about 2 orders of magnitude. See, now we're at a threshold. If we're talking about an event that's 100 times more destructive than Katrina, we're now looking at an event that would really have major consequences that it might take literally decades to recover from. And I'm talking about, we're talking about a scale that could be encompassing an entire continent, right? But the history of Earth shows us that there have been times where there have been forces unleashed that would have been 1,000 or 10,000 times more destructive than Katrina. And some of those events our ancestors lived through, you see. So it is really critically important that we learn those lessons. And when we look at modern disasters, see, this is the scale invariant phenomenon that's so important. See, we can learn a whole lot about global disasters even by looking at a local disaster. See, so when things happen, and as we sit here and speak now, we're going into seems to be into a very active volcanic phase and possibly seismic phase. So this could be something that would be ongoing now. And if the sun continues to remain inactive, as it has been for the last 3 to 4 years, there may be consequences. And so one of the things we will be doing is we'll be exploring those consequences.
All right.
And we'll be laying out potential strategies, because out of this information, we have to develop strategies.
Oh, I did not know about the strategies part. That's even more exciting.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
You did not know what?
I did not know about the strategies part. That's news to me, and that's great news.
Well, I hope you think that's a positive thing.
It is, yeah.
Because yes,
great
strategies. Yeah, and there's a number of things that would be cause for optimism. I'll say there's also some things that would be cause for pessimism, but shining light on those things, I think, is going to be important.
Yes.
And of course, there is a political component to this. Of course, there is. I mean, especially in these days of
politicizing everything,
climate change concerns, and all of that.
Yep.
Yes.
But there's also the going to the actual places that you're researching, and being on the ground there and seeing the places for yourself, documenting the stuff you see there, like what we did in Colorado. That's also going to be a part of this.
Yeah.
Oh, big part of it.
Yeah. So planning trips, going to see places, and taking people along to experience.
Absolutely. Because see, here's another implication of this, and that is that we're now living on a planet that bears witness to these events. And engraved or inscribed into the landscape of planet Earth is the whole story, right? So a big part of what I do, what Brad and I do when we go out into the field, is we are slowly piecing together the elements of this story, right? And realizing that it's on such a scale, it's on such a large scale that it's been overlooked up to this point. The things we're looking at, like if we using the Scablands in eastern Washington as an example, we can go onto Google Earth and we can see the anastomosing channeled features, the great erosional plexus in eastern Washington, just like that, right? Within a matter of seconds, we can take it all in. It took J. Harlen Bretz over 2 decades, field seasons all summer, traveling by auto and foot back and forth to finally be able to map that. So 20 years of mapping before he could really look at it and see what it was. You see, now we can see what took him 20 years to map. We can see it in 5 seconds. See, that's the difference. Back then, we had no perspective from space. We've got that now, see? And so we have all of this information. We have all these new technologies, scanning electron microscopy, for example, that allows us to look into the very small realm of reality and see things like nanodiamonds and microspherules. But on the other hand, we have now the telescopes that allow us to look out into the larger cosmic neighborhood and begin to see that we're part of a much bigger system. And here's one of the assumptions has been that up until this time, Earth has been an enclosed system, and the only input and output is solar radiation coming in, shortwave solar radiation coming in, long wave radiation being re-emitted back out, right? In that scenario, the sun has been perceived as a constant. It's not shifting. Its output is not changing. Its radiative output is remaining constant and steady. And so because you're thinking that it's unvarying, this input and output essentially allows you to ignore it in the model, see? So, but now we're suddenly having that called into major question. The sun maybe isn't as unvarying as it was assumed. In fact, maybe there's evidence that the sun is much more variable than had previously been assumed. And so up until this time, again, Earth is basically a closed system. We can ignore the input of the sun because it never really changes. So anything else that's changing would be the result of things other than the sun, see? But what we have to do now is understand that the whole solar system is, in fact, a system, and it's operating in unity. What's going on with the big outer planets is affecting the sun. The evidence for that is now overwhelming. What is happening in the sun is affecting what's happening on the Earth. Maybe not just the climate of the Earth, but things like volcanism and seismicity and tectonic activity and so on, see? So the idea here now is we have to begin looking at the big picture. And I think that would be one of the things that would be a theme that ties a lot of these together. And then, when we look at when we look at the traditional interpretation, we look at that same kind of insight, but through a more traditional lens. We see things like the Hopi Indians saying, well, the 4 disasters that preceded this world ended because humankind forgot to pay attention to the plan of the Creator. Yeah. In other words, failed to look at the big picture. And, in the Bible, it's as the people were eating, and somebody asked, Jesus when, and I'm not trying to proselytize Christianity here now. I draw from all religious traditions, right? One of the disciples asked Jesus, "When will we know when the next, when the apocalypse comes?" And he says, "Well, as it was in the days of Noah, when the people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that the flood came and swept them all away, so will it be again in the days of the coming of the Son of Man," which is simply a metaphor for the cycle completing itself, right? We can find that idea embedded in all kinds of traditions. The idea that we're not paying attention, and because we're not paying attention, we're vulnerable. See, in the biblical verse, it's not saying, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. No, that's part of the everyday life. But the problem becomes if that's your exclusive realm of attention to the point where you're ignoring the larger world, and that's when you're going to get into trouble. Yeah. When we lived up in rural Minnesota, we knew that there were certain sky conditions that foretold that there were probably tornadoes on their way, right? You could see things that usually when they came out of the west, right? Think about a tsunami, right? Tsunamis always give forewarning, don't they? I mean, if you're just like in the tsunami in Indonesia, what happens is that the shallow bays, the water recedes out of the shallow bays, right? Now, what happened was many thousands of people died because they didn't understand what nature was telling them was about to happen. So when the water receded, they happily went out and started collecting shells and fish and everything that are laying on the newly exposed seafloor, right? And now here comes the wave, see? But the ones that were educated and knew the language of nature understood what was happening when the waters in the bay swept out and exposed the bottom of the bay. They knew that water was now piling up into this great wave that was going to be coming. See, so that's a big part of it, is understanding these forces and where we are within the cycle of things. And just as we might locally prepare for a hurricane or a volcanic eruption or a tornado or even a drought, whatever the case may be, we as a global civilization need to begin putting the pieces in place to be able to survive an event and lay the groundwork for a sustainable civilization. And I think we can do it. But we don't have forever. That's the problem. And see, again, when we're talking about this, you can say, well, there's inevitably going to be another disaster. We cannot prevent that at this point. Okay, but is it going to happen 1,000 years from now or 100 years from now or 10 years from now? We don't know. But the point is you be prudent, and prudence would dictate that you assume that it could happen sooner than later, and you basically put the pieces in place, just like the thing I talked about on Russia today, a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about the sun and what would happen in the aftermath of a Carrington level event, which is something we know happened back in the 1850s, right? I would recommend anybody who's watching this to go on to our Russia Today and listen to that. It's very short. It's only, I think, 5 minutes, but the essential idea is that an event equivalent to one that happened in the 19th century, if it happened today, could basically take down our entire communication system. And we could find ourselves, large swaths of the planet could be without power for weeks, right? The satellite system could be completely decimated. This is not a fantasy. This is a very real thing that could happen, right? And I'm not saying, oh, it's going to happen next year. Hopefully not. But it could. That's the point. And having seen it happen just 150 years ago, and the consequence, because it basically took down the incipient telegraph system that was just going into place. I mean, you actually had telegraph operators sitting at their station getting electrocuted, not to death, but getting electrical shocks off of their equipment, having their equipment burst into flames, having the wires burn out and stuff. And that was because Earth got struck by a solar flare, right? So there are things that we could do, for example, to harden our system against those kind of effects. We're not doing that right now, see? And that was kind of part of what I was trying to get at on Russia Today, is things that we could do, but we haven't done them yet. So until we do those things, we're vulnerable. And a Carrington level event happening today would have enormous consequences, and it would really put a lot of people through a lot of trauma and stress if it happened.
Yeah. So one final question I thought of while you were talking, about how they ask how we know that the end times are coming, and he says, people will, so as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be again. So are we bucking prophecy? That's the whole point here. Like you look at all the predictions, the prophecies, including non-biblical ones, and they say that it's going to happen again, and no one will be paying attention. So here we are trying to break that prophecy, right?
Well, I think there's a metaphor for that, and in the biblical sense, it's the curse, right?
Yeah.
It was the curse that there's this curse that was passed on from generation to generation. It was the curse that brought on the Great Flood, right? Well, I think that part of what's concealed within that teaching is the idea of how to ameliorate that curse, how to break the curse. I kind of look at it as it's kind of a race against time, really. And I'd like to think we have a century. If we have a century, we can perhaps do it. Do we have a decade? See, now it's going to be a little more challenging. The one thing that could help accelerate this process is if we had a replay of June 30th, 1908.
Yep.
A replay of that could shake up a lot of people and change a lot of consciousness.
Yeah.
Now it's not just an abstract thing that happened in Siberia. If something like that happened again, that could be it may take, a lot of the great teachers, spiritual teachers always say, if you want to make spiritual progress, one of the things you have to be open to is shocks, to shock yourself through because in every attempt to create anything, there are always these intervals, just octaves in the interval. It's a spiritual teaching. You get to that octave, and the tendency is to either stagnate or even to divert into another direction. But you need some kind of a extra impetus or force to push you over that interval, that gap within the octave, within the tree of life, if you want to use that as a metaphor. And it takes an outside shock to do that. So one of the typical teachings of all spiritual masters was one of the things that the guru did, the master did, the teacher did, was to know when to instigate those shocks in the aspirant to knowledge. And that was part of the art of being a guru, was knowing how to instigate those shocks. Because what happens is you try things, and everybody's experienced this. You go so far into something, and then you begin to get distracted, or you begin to lose interest. Anybody who's tried to do anything, create a work of art or whatever, for me, it's might be building a house. For somebody else, it's like writing a book. Well, for me, it's been writing a book. How easy is it to get distracted by what's going on? See, sometimes what it takes is an extra one of these to bump you over. Oh yeah, I'm across it. I was getting, held up there because I couldn't jump across this gap. But now it's kind of like something happens, a shock. You get this big adrenaline rush, and suddenly, temporarily, you can do things that you weren't able to do in your normal state, right? So, a replay of June 30th, 1908 would be like a shock. It would be horrible if you had 1 million people die, or millions of, because if the Tunguska event of 1908 happened again, and it happened over a populated area of Europe, or urban eastern coast of the United States, you would have millions of people. I mean, think about that. I mean, if you dropped a hydrogen bomb on New York City, I mean, how many people would die? How many people would be injured? I mean, that's what we're talking about, something on that scale. And I think, I would like to think that it's not going to take that to get people to start paying attention, but realistically, it may take something like that before, governments of the world say, oh gosh, this is very real. We need to respond in some kind of a rational way to this. It's not just science fiction.
Or even if
in fact, the interview I did with, go ahead.
I was going to say, even if it happened, say over in a very sparsely populated area of the Amazon, which a lot of people pay attention to, if we had a giant burning hole in the Amazon,
right,
millions of people just destroyed 800 square miles of the forest, then people would start to pay attention, I think.
Yeah. But in 1908, it was possible to find a place, and Isaac Asimov pointed out the how, in a way, how unusual it was, because it was as if the thing happened in an area where it could have maximum damage, but not really kill anybody. If it had happened 4.5 hours later, Leningrad would have been erased from existence. It would have completely altered 20th century history if it had happened 4.5 hours later.
4.5 hours later
is what?
Spun a little bit, and that would have made it hit
yes.
hot. Right, yeah.
Yes, because Leningrad was on this same the same line of latitude.
Yeah.
So it would have decimated. But Isaac Asimov pointed out how odd it was that had it happened over the ocean, it may have generated a small tsunami, but nobody would have known where that came from.
Right.
Right. It would have been assumed it was an earthquake. Right. If it happened over a major populated area, a lot of people would have been killed. Right. If it had happened a little bit farther north, it would have been over the tundra, and you wouldn't have had the forest blow down, which has provided so much detailed information about the nature of the blast and the direction of entry of the object and the force. Without that forest blowdown, we wouldn't have been able to estimate what was the force unleashed during that explosion, or where that, in fact, that it happened at 5 miles up in the atmosphere. See, which tells us something about the nature of the object, that it was not able to penetrate the full depth of the atmosphere and strike the Earth. See, so the point is, if it had happened 100 miles further north, we probably never would have known about it. See, so it's like there weren't a whole lot of places around the world where that could have happened, minimized the casualties, and created maximum devastation that could have then been studied decades later to essentially reverse engineer the whole event that happened and figure it out. See,
right, which shows you that we don't even know how many times this has happened over the ocean or over the ice or whatever. We who knows?
Right. Who knows exactly?
So those are the things we're going to dive into on this podcast.
So yeah, there's
Cosmographia.
There's no shortage of
Randall Carlson.
No shortage of stuff to talk about, gentlemen.
That's right.
The Force Unleashed. Catastrophism.
Breaking prophecy. I like that. All right.
That was great.
Yep.
Well, thank you.
Yep. I think that first one is in the can. It's going into the archives and it's going to be available as soon as we
the can.
Yeah. It's in the can.
I think you need to subtitle this episode Randall Carlson Unleashed.
Randall Carlson Unleashed.
Randall Carlson does what? A Randall rant?
Randall Unleashed.
Yeah, Randall Unleashed.
Unleashed.
That's really a good broad overview starting point.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yep, it is. Brad?
Yeah, I'm going to have to slice out my own wedge of time here, but we'll figure that out. I like that we're doing Kosmographia, the Greek version. I have people comment in all the time to the YouTube videos that Randall must be the reincarnation of some Greek
Aristotle
scholar, Aristotle or Archimedes or Noah. I get all kinds of things, but yeah, I like that we're using the Greek version there.
Have you seen the statues of what was it, Zeus?
Zeus.
That Randall so amazingly resembles?
We need to get him a lightning bolt thing that he can hold. And we can take.
There we go.
Yeah, George A.
I
like that.
Find a copy of that photo and send it to these guys.
That'd be a good logo.
Yeah, it would be. Randall holding a lightning bolt. All right, guys. Well, let's close it out.
Thanks, bros.
Yeah, I will. We don't know any of the details yet of where this is going to be with the website, podcast, all that stuff, but we were going to figure all that out. This is just the first episode, and we're just getting it down on paper, as they say.
Cool.
Send us emails at something soon.
Check the website at somewhere.net.
Ready to roll.
It's all coming.
We'll get it.
Yeah. We're going to have ways to donate. There will be Patreon associated with this that will help with Randall and Brad's research, equipment purchases where we can upgrade things, get some better software. Eventually there will be streaming. It's all in the works. It's all coming. We just wanted to bang out this first episode to get that momentum going, to create that shock that Randall was just talking about.
That's right.
So what did you say? Eventually, what did I hear you say? Eventually there's going to be screaming. Oh, streaming. Streaming. Okay, I thought, okay.
I think it'll probably be both.
Eventually.
Yes. No software for that.
Right. There's no software, just scream.
No, those would be screams of joy.
Yeah.
Screams of euphoria.
Yeah.
That's already been happening in my mind while I was listening to you talk about
That's
this.
right. I'm like, we're recording the first episode of this podcast.
Okay.
All right, guys. That was awesome.
All right.
Yep.
All right.
This is Kosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast.